Hi guys, it's Gina. Welcome to the place where your growth meets mine. Let's talk. For a long time, I believed I had a problem. I carried that label attached to my life everywhere, as if it was an adjective, something that existed undeniably, something that existed independently of how I was looking at it. And it took me much longer than I would like to admit. What I was calling a problem wasn't actually what life was putting or was imposing to me, but something that my mind had decided to frame for me. Because at that time, I didn't have the depth to see it for what it really was. But I don't mean that the situation wasn't difficult or uncomfortable or demanding or whatever you want to call it. I mean that my interpretation of it was shallow. And I stood too close to it, too attached to it, and both emotionally and mentally. And I stood too close to it emotionally and mentally, and when you stand too close emotionally and mentally to anything, it starts to make you lose perspective. At that point, everything feels threatening, everything feels heavy and personal. So I mistook intensity for injustice and difficulty for meaninglessness. So at that stage of my life, I believed that a good life was one in which things flew smoothly, where resistance was minimal, where obstacles were signs that something had gone wrong. So the moment that life presented me with friction, with tension, with a situation that don't align to my expectations, my mind rushed to name it as a problem. That word alone changed everything. The moment I called it a problem, I began to fight it. I began to resent it, to wish it away, instead of listening to it, what it was asking from me. And what I see now is that my mind lacked range. It could only see one direction. Comfort versus discomfort, success versus failure, right versus wrong. Within that narrow frame, of course, the situation appeared negative. Of course, it felt like an interruption. I didn't yet understand that some experiences are not meant to be resolved quickly, but to be lived through slowly, allowing them to reshape the way that you see yourself and the world. The irony is that nothing about the external situation changed when my understanding began to shift. The circumstances remained largely the same. What changed was the depth from which I was observing them. As I began to step back internally, as I stopped reacting immediately and started reflecting, I noticed that I had called a problem, what I was calling a problem, was also forcing me to develop qualities I didn't have. Patience, humility, resilience, and a more honest relationship with myself. So, from a shallow perspective, discomfort is pointless. From a deeper perspective, discomfort is informative. It shows you where you are rigid and where are your expectations, and where your expectations are unrealistic, where your identity is too fragile to tolerate uncertainty. But you can only see that if you stop demanding that life makes sense based on your own terms. At the time, I wanted the situation to justify itself to me. I wanted to explain why it was happening, and to do so in a way that aligned with my existing beliefs. When it didn't, I called it unfair. And that's funny. What I didn't see was that the situation wasn't there to confirm what I already knew. It was there to expand what I was capable of understanding. Points of views. So this is where shallowness becomes relevant. A shallow mind asks, why is this happening to me? But a deeper mind asks, what is this asking from me? The first question assumes harm. The second question assumes meaning, and that shift in questioning changes the entire emotional landscape of the experience. And that's perfect. It's very beautiful, actually. I began to notice that the same situation that once drained me now sharpened me. The same tension that once made me feel trapped now forced me to become more precise in my thinking, more disciplined in my actions, and more honest about what truly mattered. The situation didn't transform into something pleasant, it transformed into something purposeful. And that's when it became clear that my suffering had less to do with the situation itself and more to do with the story I was telling about it. I had to interpret it like an experience through the lens of lack and resistance. And from that lens, everything looks like an obstacle, but when the lens widens, the experience revealed itself as a training ground rather than a punishment. Unfortunately, most people never make this shift, not because they are incapable. I don't believe that anyone is incapable, but because it requires patience and a willingness to suspend judgment. It's much easier to label something as a problem rather than to sit with it long enough to understand its role in your development. Calling something a problem immediately gives you an enemy, but understanding what your problem is there to teach you, that gives you direction. And looking back, I can see that my earlier interpretation was not wrong in a moral sense, but it was just incomplete. It was the interpretation of a mind that hadn't yet learned how to hold complexity. I needed the experience itself to deepen me enough to see differently. In that sense, the so-called problem was not a mistake. It was the very thing that expanded my perspective. And what this taught me is that life doesn't always challenge us to change our circumstances, but sometimes it challenges us to change the level at which we are perceiving them. And until that shift happens, the same situation will continue to appear, but in different forms, each time asking the same question: have you learned how to see yet? Now, when difficulty arises, I try not to rush to name it. I give it time, I watch my reactions, and I notice the assumptions my mind wants to make, because she's really good at judging and making assumptions real quick. So I have to train my mind, definitely, and often if I stay long enough with it, what initially felt like a problem begins to reveal itself as a catalyst, something that is carving depth where there was once only surface. So when I say my problem existed because I was shallow enough to believe it was one, I'm not denying the reality of hardship, but I'm acknowledging the power of perspective. I'm recognizing that meaning is not inherent in events themselves, but emerges from the depth of consciousness that encounters them. And maybe that's the quiet truth hidden inside many of our struggles, that life is not punishing us, but educating us. And the lesson only comes visible when we grow deep enough to recognize it. And the lesson only becomes visible when we grow up and we grow deep enough to recognize it. Hi guys, it's Gina. Welcome to the place where your growth meets mine. I'll see you next time.